What's so crazy that it sounds like a conspiracy theory but isn't? Story 1. During the Cold War, the US and the USSR were locked in a race for technological dominance, which kicked off the space race in the 1950s. Instead of hiring Stanley Kubrick to stage a fake moon landing to fool the Soviets into thinking the US was more advanced, the US government created NASA and actually sent humans to the moon. That's the part people seem to forget. How insane and ambitious that actually was. Denying the moon landing is kind of like denying that Europeans reached the Americas in 1492. To clarify, there's overwhelming evidence that Europeans crossed the Atlantic in 1492, just like there's overwhelming evidence that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in 1969. Columbus's voyage opened the door for future transatlantic travel, much like Apollo 11 laid the groundwork for later moon missions and eventually the ISS. I'm not saying these things wouldn't exist without Apollo 11, but their existence reflects a long, continuous history of development that traces directly back to that mission and the events leading up to it. Story 2. IBM supplied Nazi Germany not only with the machines, but also with the personnel needed to operate them, making it possible to identify minorities by indexing census data. Before and during World War II, IBM punch card technology was used to manage logistics within concentration camps. At the time, Germany was IBM's second largest market behind only the US. Even after the US entered the war, IBM maintained the relationship through Switzerland, using a Polish subsidiary that was under German control. IBM CEO Thomas Watson received the Iron Cross in 1937 for assisting in the tracking of roughly 500,000 minorities. He accepted it in Berlin during the Congress of the International Chamber of Commerce, where he was also elected president that same year. Story 3. I live roughly the same distance from 3 small, rural towns. In Town 1, the local donut shop got involved in money laundering and drug dealing. The owner eventually convinced the donut shop in Town 2 to join in. After about a year of booming donut and drug profits, they tried to pressure the donut shop in Town 3 to participate. When the owner refused, they shot him point blank in the face to eliminate him. Turns out he survived. He went to the police, who raided the donut shop in Town 1. A shootout followed. The original owner was killed, and the owner of the second donut shop was arrested. The third donut shop eventually reopened, and the guy survived, though he lost one eye and some fine motor control. Story 4. I'm late to the thread, but Operation Gladio checks nearly every box of a top-tier conspiracy. International politics, intelligence agencies, secret armies, shadow governments, Freemasons, false flag attacks, terrorism, and assassinations. Most of it hidden until the 1990s. The exposure of the Propaganda du Masonic Lodge in the 1980s during an Italian banking scandal revealed a membership list that read like a who's who of Italian power. Politicians, financiers, industrialists, intelligence officials, and organized crime figures. It effectively functioned as a shadow government. Operation Gladio itself was a NATO or CIA-backed stay-behind program where operatives were embedded throughout Europe. In the event of a Soviet invasion, they would activate resistance networks to fight back and recruit others. Gladio became infamous for using a strategy of tension, aiming to influence public opinion through fear, via propaganda, disinformation, psychological warfare, provocateurs, and false flag terrorist attacks. Story 5. Cashews grow on trees and develop as a seed attached to the bottom of a fruit known as the cashew apple. Cashew apples aren't commonly sold because they bruise easily and don't transport well. Correction, this is actually a long-running 4chan hoax. The cashew apple photo is a photoshopped image combining 2 Brazilian fruits, the palm pear Pilonitis cistus and the Copacabana bean Pectoralis flexus. The hoax originated on April 1, 2012, and spread through memes and repetition until it was treated as fact by mainstream outlets. Cashew farmers have been actively trying to correct this misinformation, but it's extremely persistent. Please don't help spread it further. Story 6. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is one of the most absurdly coincidental moments in history. The original assassination attempt in Sarajevo was a disaster. Several conspirators failed outright. One threw a bomb that missed. Ferdinand and his wife escaped, while the would-be assassin tried to kill himself with cyanide, which failed, and then attempted to drown in a river only a few inches deep. The assassins dispersed, and Ferdinand was supposed to leave via a different route. However, the driver wasn't informed and took the same road as before. When corrected, he stopped the car to turn around, directly next to Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators. Principal immediately shot Ferdinand and his wife. The outbreak of World War I, and indirectly World War II, hinged on a wrong turn and a stopped car. It's coincidence taken to its absolute limit. Story 7. The Michael Jordan didn't really retire theory. The idea is that Jordan didn't retire in 1993, but was secretly suspended by the NBA commissioner for gambling. Because Jordan was the league's biggest draw and endorsement machine, the NBA allegedly agreed to label it a retirement instead, allowing him to quietly sit out before returning. Jordan was a known gambler. He was caught betting over $57,000 before a 1993 playoff game, and stories circulate of him gambling tens of thousands on golf. He reportedly took losses badly. Some people link this to the murder of his father that same year. Jordan had bought his dad a car which he was driving when he pulled over to nap and was murdered. The theory suggests gambling debts or disputes may have played a role. The timeline fits and suspicions grew when the case was later reopened due to possible evidence tampering. Barry, Story 8. The song TikTok was written by Benny Blanco and includes the line, "We kick them to the curb unless they look like Mick Jagger." That's a bit odd, considering Mick Jagger wasn't exactly considered a sex symbol at the time. Here's the strange part. Benny Blanco also co-wrote Moves Like Jagger by Maroon 5. It gets weirder. The Time Dirty Bit by the Black Eyed Peas includes the lyric, "They call me Mick Jagger, I'm rolling like a stone." That song was written by John DeNicola, who once produced for a band called Chorus Flowers, better known today as Maroon 5. Story 9, in the 1980s, Coca-Cola wanted to cut costs by switching from sugar to high fructose corn syrup, but they knew consumers would notice the taste difference, so they introduced New Coke, fully expecting backlash. The plan was to keep it around long enough to reset people's taste expectations. Then, under public pressure, they would bring back Coke Classic, now made with HFCS instead of sugar. Most customers barely noticed the change and happily accept. Story 10. The idea that public technology lags about 5-10 years behind what the military has access to. That said, it really depends on the technology. Some things couldn't realistically be developed in secret. For example, it's unlikely the military has CPUs more advanced than Intel's. Too many people, too much infrastructure, and too much money for it to stay hidden. What is plausible are small-scale, specialized advances. A handful of physicists working quietly on radar absorption materials or electronic warfare concepts? That's easy to keep classified. Story 11. My mom is really into the whole Paul is dead conspiracy theory. And I have to admit there are some compelling points. The whole theory is that Paul died in a car accident in 1966 after leaving Abbey Road really early. It was raining and he lost control of his car and ended up decapitating himself in the accident. At the time, the Beatles were the biggest band in the world and a huge cash cow. The theory goes that instead of announcing that Paul was dead, the record company decided to replace him with a lookalike. That is the Paul that we know of today, who they refer to as Fall. Part of the evidence they have is that the Beatles took a several-month break right after Paul's supposed death, and no one had any idea where they were. They theorized that this time was taken to help coach Fall, helping him master the mannerisms and getting plastic surgery to help him look more like Paul. They have a lot more evidence about how there are differences in the facial structure, height, and his voice that have been analyzed by experts. They also claim that the Beatles hid a lot of hints in their music and albums. While I personally think it's more the Beatles trolling than anything, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it turned out to be true. I mean, it's not that crazy to think a greedy record company would replace one of their most profitable artists if they had the chance. Story 12. Shia LaBeouf. Back in 2001, actor Louis Stevens was just an up-and-coming child star on the Disney Channel. It was manufactured stardom, of the sort that we've seen from entities like Britney Spears or Justin Timberlake, but it had the potential to go a long way. Stevens, however, had other ideas, so he invented the persona of Shia LaBeouf. He chose the name because it means praise God for the beef in the original Gaulish, and his stated intention with the character was to have it be a caricature of fame, with meat, or the beef, being a representation of both wealth and influence. Other actors have done similar things, of course. Everyone is familiar with Sacha Baron Cohen's Ali G or Borat, for instance, and surprisingly few people realize that Larry the Cable Guy is a character played by Daniel Whitney, who developed the fake Southern accent he uses by meshing the Georgian and Texan accents of his college roommates. The thing is, there's still plenty of available evidence for those folks' real identities. When Stevens created Shia LaBeouf, however, he went as far as to hire reputation editors and public image consultants to erase any hints of who he really is. In fact, if you were to research Louis Stevens nowadays, you'd actually find references to him being a character played by Shia LaBeouf. It's an incredibly subtle piece of meta-commentary, I'm sure you'll agree. Story 13. That the Petraeus affair and subsequent firing was a cover-up for a coup. At the same time, quite a few generals and various other government employees, including a couple not actually in the DoD, were fired. In all, it was about 30, each with little to no connection to Petraeus whatsoever. Some of his bodyguards and some of his mistress's family came out and said that he was plotting a coup. Other rumors were that he was going to install a super right-wing fascist government. This is commonly thought of as right-wing propaganda, and I'm liberal, but seeing how a lot of his supposed cronies were really scary right-wing types and uber-nationalistic, I can see this being true. Story 14, that the Soviets placed sleeper agents in the US who would awaken and transform into assassins at the sound of a code word. The CIA was a basket case of paranoia during the 60s dealing with this idea. They had information and disinformation from both Soviet defectors and captives who were interrogated, both confirming and denying the program's existence to cause confusion. Some people say the CIA almost collapsed from within on pure paranoia. Some people say Lee Harvey Oswald was one and the guy who killed him. Story 15, to get people to attack each other if they call anything out on its bullcrap. Poor people keep each other in check. Rich, police, the military, and politicians do as they please and always have scapegoats and fall guys in place. If you think a lot of this stuff is coincidence, you're a fool. These people plan this crap out to science. Your freedom is based on how much money you have. Keep as many black people and minorities down as possible, the elites get better, and the gap gets bigger, and so be it, if the lesser whites in between are casualties. I'd trade every other famous black athlete, musician, actor to be doctors or lawyers or politicians if I could. There are literally no upper middle class or gated communities where it's at least 50% black. Story 16, all the world's best cyclists were on steroids, and there was a huge cover-up. I remember a close friend of mine who played college baseball in the early 2000s telling me that every college baseball player he knew who was trying to be competitive and make a career was doping. That's when I realized that drug use extended far, far beyond what was shocking people in the news at the time. I still don't think we know the half of it, honestly. Story 17, John Lennon sounded paranoid and full of himself when he claimed his phones were tapped and he was being tracked by US government agents. He was more right than he even knew. He was in hot water for his stance against the Vietnam War, and his peace movement was the leading anti-war motion at the time. The reason John Lennon was a target was because he, like MLK, actually used peace to advertise his message. There was nothing physically imposing about the movement. He used peace to promote peace, and it was working. The government was looking for anything they could to get him out of the country. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Story 18. Okay, just in case people thought I was joking, there really was a conspiracy called the United States Army beef scandal, and it did turn out to be true. During the Spanish-American War armor, the meat company ended up with a large amount of highly contaminated beef. If they disposed of it, they'd lose a large amount of money. So they sold it to the government who knew it was contaminated. They turned around and shipped it off to the soldiers fighting in Cuba. All those jokes about army rations being old and/or contaminated stuff, it was real. A lot of soldiers got violently sick and there were more than a few deaths from this. Story 19. I came here to mention Hemingway, but someone called it. The FBI engaged in a campaign to harass, intimidate, defame, and discredit actress Jean Seberg in retaliation for publicly supporting the Black Panthers. Most famous for starring as Joan of Arc in St. Joan, interestingly enough. She was wiretapped and constantly stalked. J. Edgar Hoover personally reported the status of the Seberg operation to Nixon's public affairs chief John Ehrlichman. When she was pregnant, they floated a false story that the father of her child was not her husband's, but rather the child of a prominent Black Panther Party member. The FBI was able to get a Hollywood gossip columnist to run with the story, and the stress caused her to go into premature labor. The baby died. She herself died of an overdose at 40, officially reported as a probable suicide. However, her blood alcohol content was twice what would have made someone comatose and unable to move, so her ability to have taken the pills she consumed on her own is highly unlikely. The FBI owned up to the harassment in 1979. Story 20. That the German government helped to smuggle Lenin back into Russia to help overthrow the Russian monarchy. Negotiations with the provisional government to obtain passage through Germany for the Russian exiles in return for German and Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war dragged on. Eventually, bypassing the provisional government, on the 31st of March, the Swiss communist Fritz Platen obtained permission from the German foreign minister through his ambassador in Switzerland, Baron Gisbert von Romberg, for Lenin and other Russian exiles to travel through Germany to Russia in a sealed one-carriage train. At Lenin's request, the carriage would be protected from interference by a special grant of extraterritorial status. There is much evidence of German financial commitment to the mission of Lenin. The aim was to disintegrate Russian resistance in the First World War by spreading revolutionary unrest. Weeks says, Well, after April 1917, the Germans continued to subsidize the subversive Lenin as well as his subsequent Bolshevik regime into 1918. Story 21. Every year, a rich group of elite men who run the world get together, get drunk, piss in the woods, put on plays where they dress in drag, and conduct a ritual where they burn an effigy in front of a giant owl, for many years voiced by Walter Cronkite. No wives allowed. Nixon attended and called it the most faggy goddamn thing you could ever imagine. To my mind, this is definitely one of those backcrap things you just wouldn't believe if it weren't actually true. Story 22. Just recently, it was confirmed that President Johnson had brokered a peace deal in Vietnam, and Nixon had Kissinger scuttle it so he could win the election. Johnson actually had Kissinger on tape telling essays Vietnam to end the peace talks so they could have more favorable terms under a Nixon administration. Johnson didn't release the tape because it was obtained illegally. That tape or other evidence of Nixon prolonging the Vietnam War was probably what the Watergate guys were looking for. That phone call prolonged the war for 5 years, during which 15,000 US soldiers died. Plus, I don't know how many Vietnamese and Cambodians. Story 23. The man is watching us. Man. They're reading all our texts and emails and listening in on our pro-phone calls. Fun story that I have no way to verify, but I'll tell it anyway. My grandfather was a telecommunications engineer for the US government throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He worked for NASA as well as the CIA. He's always been a quiet dude and never really talks about himself or his past. Well, one day I drove to pick him up for Thanksgiving dinner, and we drove by this big, old, windowless blue building that was once on government land but is now owned by a private company. I point to it and say, "You know, I've probably passed this building a couple times a month for 20 years now, and I've never known what it was used for. I mean, it's just so weird. Why would a 5-story building like that have no windows?" He thinks for a minute and then responds, "Well, since you asked, that building used to contain, I don't know what it's used for anymore, a series of computer servers that would record outgoing phone calls from the US to foreign countries. It was really hush-hush, as I don't think the feds had any kind of a warrant to be recording those calls, but it was meant to hunt down Soviet spies. Which is why I was surprised at the reaction when Snowden leaked those files. I thought it was common knowledge the US government had been recording phone calls without warrants since the Cold War." Story 24. According to David Brock, who was, in his own words, a right-wing hitman at the time, Hillary Clinton was right when she said that there was a vast right-wing conspiracy against her and her husband. Brock, a former insider, detailed the workings of movement conservatives, more commonly known as neocons, in his excoriation Blinded by the Right. A former intimate of Ann Coulter, Brock provides a roadmap of aggressors, their individual joint and shared motives, the channels of money and communications, media structures, and much more. The ultimate goal was no less than the usurpation of political power in Washington to serve the ends of those at the top of the neocon food chain, patently evil men such as Richard Mellon Scaife, whom Brock suggests may have even ordered real hits. The sordid tale, nauseating in its soul-grinding treachery, is more or less chronological, ending with Brock himself being targeted after breaking ranks. Story 25. Border incidents between Poland and Germany were in fact German special units, which would become the Brandenburgers, messing with the German border guard station. The night before the German invasion, before war was in fact declared, those same units snuck back into Poland in civilian clothing and seized strategic buildings and key locations. That way, the following day, German tanks just sailed through. They actually tried the same against the Dutch, but many operators were captured, and following the Geneva Convention, were executed on sight. Another World War II conspiracy theory turned true, the Katyn massacre. The NKVD executed around 2,200 Polish officers, cops, and civilians in 1940 after the invasion of Poland. The mass graves were discovered by the Germans in 1943, and the Soviets promptly accused them of the massacre. The Russian authorities came out with the truth in 1990. Story 26. Probably too late to be seen, but this is the craziest conspiracy I ever heard. A large number of protesters were shot and killed in the lead-up to the Mexican Olympics in 1968. The Mexican government was tired of widespread protesting, making them look bad, so they waited until a large protest was being staged outside a governmental building. The building was lined with cops and security. Official story, protesters attacked the cops retaliated, chaos ensued. Real story, the government hid CIA sharpshooters, I forget the Mexican equivalent of the CIA, in buildings nearby. When the protest was in full swing, the CIA opened fire on the cops. The cops, believing the protesters were attacking, fired on the protesters. Many protesters were killed. Counts of deaths to this day are unknown, since the government had planned for this and had crews ready. Once the protesters were scattered, the crews moved in and cleaned the entire scene up. No bodies left, no blood. To this day, no one knows how many people were killed there. It worked out mostly for the government. The protest movement was largely squashed that day. This is known because a recent Mexican president, in the name of openness, opened up a bunch of old government files, so it's well documented. Story 27. Pearl Harbor and 9/11 are often accused of being domestic attacks to justify declaring a war. This is called a false flag operation, and though neither of those are examples, real false flags have happened, and more often than you'd think, and some consider the Reichstag fire to be such an event. The US government paid a DC ad agency to produce and distribute in Mexico music meant to discourage Mexicans from crossing the border. One example is a song whose lyrical content described a man attempting to cross the border with his family, only for it to go very badly. Story 28. That the US government is actively spying on its citizens. The Snowden leaks simply confirm that our individual, identifying information is being collected without our consent or an option to opt out. Even if you're not suspected of any wrongdoing, you are being observed. Remember when it was a big deal that cameras were going up on every intersection? Remember when we used to be incensed that laws were being passed which meant we had less privacy? Informed people understood that domestic spying was the eventuality of the Patriot Act. Also, the media and politicians have shady agendas. This is proven true in various ways on a regular basis, to the extent that it no longer even warrants the word theory unless it's used in the scientifics. People who send you millions of messages during your lifetime, and elected officials who dictate your best interest, do not sincerely care about your well-being. Story 29. People should look into Iran-Contra more. Basically what happened is that Reagan and the Republicans cut deals with our sworn enemies at the time, Iran, to hold hostages and not make any deals with the Carter administration for their release, just so Carter would look bad and lose the next election. When Reagan won, the Iranians would release their hostages because of the big scary John Wayne president man, and in return, the Reagan administration sold them weapons and parts for missiles and planes that they desperately needed. Then, with the money they got selling weapons to our enemies, they funded an illegal drug war in South America, where they pushed innocents off their lands, warred against some drug lords, and propped up others that would cooperate with the CIA. Story 30. Many people are listing crazy and/or horrible things the US government has done. Those were not conspiracy theories. Not one of these was ever predicted or exposed by the sorts of fringe lunatics who speculate wildly about conspiracies without evidence. Every one was exposed by people with actual evidence. People involved and trusted as part of the operation, who found that what had been attempted covertly went against their conscience. Fringe lunatics who speculate wildly about conspiracies without evidence. This definition of conspiracy theory only has one purpose: to allow people to discredit other people with two words, at least in the minds of the lazy and/or weak-minded. I guarantee that the phrase conspiracy theory has been widely used to try to discredit every single incident that was ever exposed by people with actual evidence, people involved and trusted as part of the operation who found that what had been attempted covertly went against their conscience. Story 31. The controlled demolition of World Trade Center Building 7. I know I'll get downvoted like crazy because you all are still controlled by the mass media, but facts and physics do not lie. Building number 7 was absolutely, without a doubt, brought down by human beings that used precisely placed controlled charges to bring this massive, overbuilt, super reinforced steel skyscraper down onto its own footprint in just under 7 seconds. The official ruling: a few sporadic office fires. Story 32. Operation Northwoods. During our issues with Cuba back in the 60s, a proposal originating from the Department of Defense was written up and signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stating that they wanted to dress U.S. agents up as Cubans and attack Guantanamo Bay, also blow up a drone airliner over U.S. soil and say it was a Cuban terrorist attack. They even had alibis for all the fake people aboard. The first time I heard about it, I couldn't believe our government was capable of doing something that dirty. Actually, I still can't believe it. Story 33. That the US distributed textbooks to children in the Middle East, can't remember exactly what countries, that gave detailed instructions complete with diagrams on how to assassinate in the 80s and 90s when the US was concerned about the Soviets. These books essentially fueled what became the Taliban. I learned this yesterday in the documentary The Muslims I Know. I thought that the whole "the us created the Taliban" thing was a conspiracy or reference to the effect of our actions. But no, we actually created it. Story 34. The Lone Gunman, a spin-off of the popular series The X-Files, is a television show that aired on the Fox network featuring the characters of the same name. The show first aired in March 2001 and, despite good reviews, was canceled due to a drop in ratings. The last episode aired in June 2001. The debut of the show in March 2001 began with Byers' father faking his death to uncover a conspiracy to hijack an airliner. The lone gunman tried to get to the truth of his supposed death and uncover the conspiracy. One retrospectively relevant aspect of this pilot episode is that the airliner has been hijacked via remote control of the plane's autopilot. And by the end, both Byers and his father have boarded the plane to try to stop the hijacking. Through the aid of the other gunmen, they are able to regain control of the plane and just miss crashing into the World Trade Center with the airliner. This, of course, was before the actual 9/11 attack against the World Trade Center later that year. Similar to theories posited about the events of 9/11, the episode's plot indicates that the hijacking was committed as an act of veracity by a greedy American arms manufacturer to ultimately increase its weapons sales by invoking U.S. retaliation against a scapegoated anti-American extremist dictator. Story 35. Okay, listen to me, said Gray. No, really hear me out. Burp. Okay, so I have this ham radio in my house that I get police transmissions from Washington, D.C. on. The other day I'm listening and guess what the hell I hear? Take a drink, guess? No, really, guess? They say there were some guys snooping around the Watergate hotel with flashlights. Well, guess what? Here's where it gets interesting. Guess what just went down there? The Democratic National Convention. So gee, I wonder who could possibly be behind this. You know who it was. Nixon. That's right, baby. I'll bet you $1 billion this crap goes right up to the top and there's a vast cover-up in the midst. Just watch.